And we have also the very first mentioning of an Indian outside of India, which is there in a court case which happens in Sumeria, in which you hear about a court case where about a drunken brawl. So in this drunken brawl, what happens is that this Meluhan punches a local in the face and breaks his teeth in a drunken brawl. And then he is asked to pay a fine of several silver coins. So since this Meluhan was probably very likely a Gujarati, it may well be the source of prohibition in Gujarat. Now, the question that arises is, what were the Indians importing from the Middle East? And this is a big, big controversy. This is also true, by the way, about what they were doing with the Central Asia, because we have, just like the Middle East, we have lots of signs of the Indians were trading with Central Asia. So if you go, there are places in Tajikistan and so on where we have also found Harappan outposts, and they were clearly, again, exporting all kinds of things, including beads and things like that. So they were clearly an export-oriented economy, but still they must have been importing something. And there's a lot of controversy about what those imports were, because we have never found anything of either clearly Central Asian or of Middle Eastern origin in any Harappan site. Now, it's possible that they were importing consumables like dates or wine or something like that. But one intriguing possibility is that they were there to import horses, because we know that horses were being used by the Bronze Age in both Central Asia and in the Middle East. So although there aren't any Harappan seals with the horses, clearly in touch with civilizations that were using horses. And more recently, in certain sites like Sorkoda, etc., in Gujarat, horse bones have been found. So the Harappans were unaware of here. May I request people to switch off their mute themselves, because I can hear too many people. Kindly, can you mute yourselves? Thank you. So now what happened is that very likely you had horses coming in. Now, you may assume that the horses would have mostly come from Central Asia, but in fact, we have now a lot of evidence to suggest that the horses were originally not from Central Asia at all, from what is now Arabia, because the earliest signs of human and horse interaction appear in paintings in what is now in the middle of Saudi Arabia, in the deserts of Saudi Arabia. Remember, again, climate was different. These were all savanna lands. And it turns out that the horse is not a northern but a southern animal. In fact, many things that were assumed to be Central Asian wild horses, genetic studies now have shown that these are not wild horses at all, but descendants of ancient horses that had escaped from human tamed groups of horses. So these are not directly wild horses, but in fact feral horses. So again, it's quite interesting that maybe our entire thinking about where horses came from, where they were tamed, etc., has to look from a much more southern source, and very likely from what is now Arabia. So given that is the context, it is very likely that the Harappans importing their horses. Now, in this context, we need to think about where do you fit the Vedic texts. For this, you need to know how the Harappan civilization ended. The Harappan civilization and the Sumerians, all of them suddenly all came to a grinding halt around about 2000 BC. Now, the reason they all suddenly came to a halt was because of a couple of 100 years of extreme drought and hit all these civilizations at the same time. And as a result of which, we know that climate change was the key reason why these civilizations all collapsed. Now, the Harappans, we have now more than adequate information that you can see that as these great Harappan cities began to collapse, they were also going through a phase where the cropping patterns changed. They moved from wheat and rice to growing more millets, which were clearly requires less water, and they moved to much smaller communities. So there's no sudden break. Rather, what you have is a slow decline of these large cities into smaller cities and smaller communities. There's a breakdown of municipal culture, but there is continuity of culture. So this is clearly not a invasion or sudden change in behavior, rather a slow decline of a couple of centuries, and it clearly coincides with climate change. Now, when this climate change is happening, there is also a breakdown in trade patterns that I talked about, because obviously these great voyages that the Indians were making was based on an urban culture. Now, as the urban culture broke down both in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, by the way, as well, it also broke down, by the way, in the Jiroft area, which was an important. It's in southern Iran, and was clearly linked to Harappan. You see all these cities break down, and so you see also Dholavira and all these cities all get abandoned. So this entire trading culture broke down. Now, in this context, the question arises: where does the Vedic texts fit? Now, it's very interesting here that when this culture broke down, the Harappan culture broke down, it coincided, of course, with the entire Ghaggar river system drying up. Now, this is important because the Ghaggar is a very, very important to the Harappan civilization. There are far more sites on the Ghaggar than there are, in fact, on the Indus. So, in fact, and so the question is such a river mentioned in the Vedic text? And the answer is absolutely yes. The Saraswati River is the most important river in the Vedic text. It is mentioned much more often than either the Ganga or the Sindhu. It is also in the Nadistuti Suktam clearly told where it is. It is between the Sutlej and the Yamuna. Now, that leaves only one high riverbed, which it has to be the Ghaggar. There is no question about it. It also fits with the fact that it was clearly had a large community living around it. As I mentioned, the largest cities of the Harappans, like Rakhigarhi, etc., are along this Rai riverbed. We know that this river went all the way down to Gujarat. We know that the Dholavira was near this the estuary of this river. Clearly, this river was very important to this culture. So, it is very clear that the Vedic civilization was a part of the Harappan civilization. Now, I want to make this point clear. You see, what do you mean by Vedic civilization? If you mean by it the people that are clearly described in Rig Veda, then let me also say that the Rig Veda is, first of all, largely deals with a subset of the Harappan. It's not about all the Harappan. It's a subset. It deals with a tribe called the Bharatas, who lived in and around Haryana, what is now Haryana, and maybe some part of eastern Punjab. They lived in an land that they themselves called the land of seven rivers, or Sapta Sindhu. This does not, by the way, this is a landscape very mistakenly is usually taken as five rivers of the Punjab. It did not include the five rivers of the Punjab. It relates only to the Saraswati and its own tributaries, because it is very clear from the text that all the seven rivers flow into the Saraswati. So it does not include the Sindhu or its tributaries. So where is this landscape? This landscape is essentially, as I said, Haryana, and a little bit of eastern Punjab and some bit of northern parts of Rajasthan. That is the landscape that you're talking about. The importance of this Vedic culture is that it mentions the first empire that the Indians ever built, which was built by a tribe called the Bharatas, led by a chieftain called Sudasa and his guru called Vasishtha. And it mentions that it fought this great battle against this alliance of 10 kings coming in from the west, from western Punjab and Afghanistan probably, whom they then defeated on the Ravi. And they defeated them. So that is basically the sum total of what we know about this. We also know that then Sudas turned eastward and defeated a tribe led by a chieftain called Bheda on the banks of the Yamuna. And therefore, he created this first empire. Now, the interesting part is that this empire was uh, set up by a tribe called the Bharata Triksu tribe. And it's quite interesting what they then did is that they then did not impose their own gods on all the other tribes. They were obviously worshippers of Indra, but what they did is they compiled instead the Rig Veda, which is actually a compilation of the all the tribes of that time, including the defeated tribes. And they compiled all the ideas, the religious uh, texts, and ideas of all the rishis that were known at that time, and compiled into the Rig Veda, and then it grew into the 4 Vedic texts. Now, this is why it is interesting, because this is essentially the template of Indic civilization. In that, in this, if you read the very last shloka of the Rig Veda, it mentions come together, sit together. It's called a Samanasya Suktam. And it talks about how all the tribes were asked and all their gods were given a place around the fire, around the sacred fire. So this was the first, not only creation of the first empire, although it was originally set up based on military power, what the Bharatas did then created a template for assimilation, which then expanded over time and kept incorporating new areas. Even when the tribe itself may have gone into decline, the idea was so powerful that 5,000 years later, I'm a Bengali. I clearly don't come from Haryana. But I consider myself a Bharata because my ancestors bought into this idea of assimilation as opposed to imposition. So this is why this idea comes directly from the Rig Veda. But here we are talking about, we're not getting into that line of debate. I'm just giving you a sense of who these people were. But what they do is they mention this river called the Saraswati. And they very clearly mention that this river was in full flow from the mountain to the ocean. Now, we know from ground surveys and now many surveys of oxygen levels in groundwater and so on, that this river Ghaggar had already begun to stop being a glacial run river by 3500 BC. And that by around it was still, by the way, a very substantial river after that because the rains were so heavy, so it was still a pretty substantial river, but it completely dries up by 2000 BC. Now, the Rig Veda, since it mentioned a fully flowing river, was 100% had to be composed before 2000 BC, while the big cities were still there. But it seems to have been composed in an even earlier era because by the time the big Harappan cities were composed, this river had already begun to go into decline, which is mentioned in the Puranic text, but not in the Rig Vedic text. So, suggesting to me that we are dealing with a text that is before 3200 BC, because that's when roughly you already begin to see the river begin to dry up. So you are really dealing with the Rig Veda is actually an early Harappan text, or maybe even a pre-Harappan text. So you're dealing with a civilization that was not yet building large cities, but probably just about beginning to urbanize, because there are cities mentioned in the Rig Veda, but they don't seem to be the large Harappan cities. You're really dealing with a very early text. However, since there is a lot of controversy about horses, let me also tell you in this context, the Rig Veda is very clear about one thing, which is the association of the horses with the ocean. It does not associate the horses with Central Asia or the mountains as it would have been if there was something they associated northward. Instead, the horse is something they associate with the south. Again, they link with Arabia. The Ashwins, for example, are the twins, the horse twins. And the Ashwins come from the sea, they rise from the sea. This is clearly an allusion to the fact that horses had an allusion to the ocean. They were not something coming from the north. Again, this makes absolute sense. Because if you just look at a geographical book, this whole idea of Aryans coming from the north on chariots is utter rubbish. Because even if they were driving chariots in Central Asia, by the time they went through the mountains of Afghanistan, the Pamir Knot, the Hindu Kush, and then went across the several rivers of Punjab, I can assure you, everybody would have abandoned their chariots. Without roads, taking your horses through the Hindu Kush would not have been fun. And they would certainly have had zero military advantage for the simplest reason that there is no point in using horses in a mountainous, using chariots in the mountainous area. And the horses we are dealing with are clearly very small. Horses really became big in the medieval period. Early horses were very small animals, not much bigger than a mule. And consequently, they were not capable of dealing with a horseman sitting on the horse. Earliest uses of horses were all with chariots because of this reason. And so you are dealing, consequently, the Vedic people were almost certainly pre-Harappan. They were almost certainly a subset of a wider landscape. This is very important. Just because we have a great affinity to the Rig Veda because of religious reasons does not mean that it is the sum total of all the knowledge of that time. It is just happens to be the one set of books that have survived. That's all. There were many books around them that have not survived. So just because one book has survived, we shouldn't assume that that is the only one. And it happens to be the testimony of an important tribe called the Bharatas, but there would have been many other tribes. So just because the Bharatas are important and we happen to have civilizationally adopted their culture, it does not mean that the landscape of the Harappans was somehow had only one culture. They may have shared some of the culture, or that they had one great empire. It may have been made up of many kingdoms. And given the long periods of time, many things may have happened in many cycles along the way. Anyway, by the time we have the end of this civilization, by 2000 BC, one important thing needs to be remembered, that there were already other civilizations in other parts of the country. So we tend to get an impression from reading from our text that you're dealing with a Gangetic Plains that was essentially empty. That's not true. There were already large numbers of people living in the Gangetic Plains, and it's very likely that cities like Varanasi were already fairly old cities and were contemporaneous, probably, to Harappan cities. We now have, from a dig in Sanyal, in Bagpat, in the Gangetic Plains, where we have discovered chariots and so on. So clearly, not only did they have an advanced civilization, they already had chariots, horses, and bronze weapons, etc., being used in the Gangetic Plains at the same time that the Harappans were in existence and were in decline. So this is the landscape you're dealing with. Now, this is the time where something very interesting happened in Southern India. Southern India, as I said, we haven't yet found any signs of a Bronze Age civilization. May have existed, it's possible, but we haven't found them. But one thing is now known, is that what we now know as we do have clearly some technological capacity existed in Southern India, because the next great shift in our civilization happened in the Godavari basin, where iron was essentially systematized. So iron technology is an Indian technology, and it is a Southern Indian technology. Interestingly, the first systematic use of iron anywhere in the world happened in and around Hyderabad. In fact, in Hyderabad campus is where campus iron about 4,000. The request, however, is
Audience, please mute yourself. Audience, I request, please mute yourself.
Thank you.
Audience, I request please mute yourself.
Audience, requesting you to please mute yourself. It's really disturbing. Please. Audience, please.
Admin, you can see who the person is and mute them. That's not a difficult thing. So all you need to do is to find out who's doing it and mute them.
We have expelled him. Please continue, sir. Sorry for interruption.
So now what happens is that this iron technology spreads from the Godavari Valley into the middle and eastern Gangetic plains. And you have rapidly expansion of iron technology in the Gangetic plains in the between 2000 and 1300 BC. And it's quite interesting that it's only in the Middle East you begin to see the arrival of technology. It arrives with a group called the Mitanni. And the Mitanni turn up with iron technology around about 1300, 1400. This is almost 500 years after it has become commonplace in India. But the Mitanni is also very interesting because the Mitanni are actually they seem to worship Indian gods like Indra, Varuna, and so on. So there's very high likelihood that the Mitanni, who set up an empire in Iraq, were actually Indians. And they built an empire, and interestingly, they married into the Egyptian royalty, because you see Queen Nefertiti, you may have heard of Queen Nefertiti, she was a Mitanni. So it's quite likely, consequently, she was of Indian origin. Anyway, so now what happens is that the action clearly shifts away from the northwest into the Gangetic plains. And of course, many of the Iron Age cities that were built at that time are cities that we hear about in the epics, whether it is Hastinapur or Indraprastha and so on. Some of these cities, as you know, have survived to modern times. Varanasi may be a Bronze Age city. It certainly is an Iron Age city and became very important. But what you see also is the growth of commerce along the eastern seaboard. So the area which is between Lake Chilika in Odisha to what is now West Bengal, and the westernmost outlet of the Ganga now becomes very active for trade. And you begin to see sites popping up, such as Chandraketugarh in Bengal, just north of Kolkata. It's near Damdam. And you have these many ports which begin to pop up all along the Odisha coast. And the people of this coast, they begin to now explore the coastline. Now remember, at this juncture, these Iron Age explorers do not yet know how to cross the sea. They just are able to go along the coastline. And you begin to see these Odia Bengali sailors begin to sail along the coast downwards towards, down past the Andhra coast, past the Tamil coast to Sri Lanka. And at some point, they begin to settle Sri Lanka. And it is quite interesting that the people who we now know as the Sinhalese are essentially the descendants of these Bengali Odia merchants and explorers who made their way along the coast and began settling it somewhere around the 6th, 7th century BC. And in fact, the Mahavamsa, which is the national myth of the Sinhalese, talks about a prince who came from the land of Vanga or Bengal, and he comes under the lion flag, which is still the Sinhalese flag, and how the lion people then colonize Sri Lanka. And of course, the Sinhalese language, of course, has very close link to Bengali and Odia to this day. So, and genetic tests have also now shown the impact of this. So, this is one direction in which these Bengali Odia merchants were sailing. They were also sailing in the other direction, and we know that they were sailing down the coast towards Southeast Asia. Again, remember, they are sailing along the coast. They are not in a condition to sail across the Bay of Bengal. And they begin to visit along the coast the Isthmus of Kra. This is the bit of Thailand near Phuket, from which Malaysia hangs off. And they would sail there, and from there they would cross to the other side, which is it's a very small distance, maybe 30, 40 kilometer stretch of land. And then you end up on the other side from where you can sail out towards the Mekong Delta, which is, what is now southern Vietnam and Cambodia and so on. And you begin to see the influence of Indian civilization begin to pop up in that area. Now, there are no clear Indian texts referring to these merchants sailing out eastward, but there are many legends in Vietnam and in Cambodia which talk about this period. And they speak particularly of one legend which is quite interesting about a merchant fleet led by a Brahmin captain called Kaundinya. And the legend goes somewhat as follows, that Kaundinya was sailing along the Mekong Delta. We don't know when, but it could have been maybe 5th, 6th century BC. And he was sailing along with in a merchant ship when he was attacked by a group of pirates, local pirates, and he was able to fend them off. Unfortunately, his ship developed a leak, so he had to then ground his ship on on the land to try and repair it. But when they were doing it, the pirates or maybe a local tribe again surrounded them, and again Kaundinya rallied his troops to try and defend himself. Unfortunately, things looked quite dire because they were completely outnumbered. So, nonetheless, they had no choice. So they were trying to defend themselves against these pirates. But then luck turned in their favor because the leader of this tribe that had surrounded them was a beautiful warrior princess called Soma. And Soma saw Kaundinya and she fell in love. And so she proposed marriage to Kaundinya. Now, I suppose Kaundinya didn't have too much choice, so he accepted this proposal and they got married. And as a result of this marriage, an Indianized kingdom called Funan was set up in what is now southern Vietnam and Cambodia area. And this kingdom of Funan and this particular marriage would then lead to a series of Indianized kingdoms in this part of the world. Now, it is interesting here that for the next 1,500 years, all subsequent empires, almost 2,000 years in fact, all some subsequent dynasties that would rise in this area would try and trace their lineage back to this particular marriage. So obviously whatever happened was very important. Now the question then arises, who was Kaundinya? Now we have no idea who Kaundinya is. In Indian records, there is no sign of Kaundinya. But we do know one interesting thing. Because Kaundinya is not a common name in India, even in ancient times, but it is a Gotra. And this Gotra comes from today from the area of southern Odisha, Andhra, and some part of northern Tamil coast. So that coastline from Chennai to Chilika, coastline is where to this day a Gotra of Brahmins live. Who call themselves Kaundinya. So it is quite interesting that this is the region from which possibly, we are guessing, possibly a merchant called Kaundinya had set sail. So, it's possible that he had something to do with that area. Anyway, now, over the next several centuries, trade booms on both the coastlines of India. And you begin to see major ports appear. Now, on the eastern side, a very major port appears called Tamralipti, which is now Tamluk, very close to IIT Kharagpur, by the way. It's now that very few remains of that there, but Tamluk was for almost 1,000 years India's biggest port. It was the biggest port of both the Mauryan and then later on of the Gupta Empire. And on the west coast, you begin to see many ports begin popping up in Gujarat, all the down the coast, Maharashtra, Karnataka coast, and then of course the Kerala coast, where a very major port called Butcheripatnam began to emerge. Now, by now, we are in the 1st century AD. Now, by the 1st century AD, one important change happens, is that the merchants who are plying the Indian Ocean have by this time figured out the monsoon winds, and they have figured out that these winds blow in very regular intervals, first in one direction and then in the other direction. So this allows you to sail one way for one season and then come back to the same place, point of origin, the other way. So in the West Coast, what happened as a result, we begin to see huge amount of trade happening between India and the Roman Empire. And the trade usually happened with basically traders would sail. If you were a Roman trader, you would set out from Alexandria, sail up the Nile, then you would cross the short distance of the desert to the Red Sea, and you would sail down the Red Sea to an island to past what is now Yemen, to an island called Socotra or Dweepasukadhara, which is what the Indians called it. And from Dweepasukadhara, you could have the option of sailing north towards Oman and then towards Gujarat, or you had the option of sailing using the monsoon winds to sail across to Karnataka, Kerala coast, to or Muzaris, as the Romans used to call it. And why did they come here? They were here to essentially trade Indian products. So what were these Indian products? The Indian products were, of course, spices. This included black pepper, which was an Indian product, but it also included many spices that the Indians were actually purchasing in Indonesia. So many spices that the Europeans called Indian were not Indian at all, but were Indonesian spices that the Indians had bought from the Indonesians and were then selling on to the Europeans. Then the Indians were exporting cloth. The cotton, you have to remember, is an Indian plant. And even in Harappan times, Indians used to export cloth and silk. And certainly they were exporting cloth of various kinds, cotton and silk, to the Europeans. They were, as you know, iron and steel was an Indian invention, and ancient world, even in medieval world later on, would consider Indian steel as being very, very highly regarded. So there was a lot of metallurgical products that the Indians were exporting. The question is, what were they importing? Now, they were importing wine. Italian wines were very popular in India. Greek olive oil was popular. The nobility were much into importing good-looking women for the harems, evidently. We are told that. But despite all these imports, it appears that the Indians ran very large current account surpluses with the Roman Empire, because of which the Romans had to keep paying Indians in gold coins. And so much gold and silver was coming out of the Roman Empire that the Roman Senate had these debates about how to ban trade with India, because the Indians were sucking out too much gold. This is not a trivial problem, because you see, if Indians were sucking out so much gold, it meant that there was not enough gold to print coins in the Roman Empire, as a result of which they had severe monetary squeeze, what today we would call a severe monetary squeeze in the Roman Empire. So Romans finally had to solve it by reducing the amount of gold and silver in their coins and debasing their coins. Anyway, so this was going on the West Coast. East Coast, similarly, we had figured out how to cross the sea. And you had these merchant ships that would cross the sea out towards Indonesia. Now, they would not sail directly out. The way Indian merchants would sail out was that they would set out from the Bengal, Odisha area. They would then sail along the Andhra, Tamil coast to Sri Lanka, to what is now the Trincomalee area. And from then, they would sail directly eastward using the ocean current to Sumatra. And then from Sumatra, either they would sail down the Malacca Straits towards Singapore and out towards China and Japan and Korea, or they would then sail further down south along the west side of Sumatra to Java, Bali, and so on. And so much trade was happening that there was a festival that still survives in Odisha called Bali Jatra, or the Voyage to Bali. And this happens on Kartik Purnima. And this is interesting because in Kartik Purnima is the time at which the winds turn. So they turn from blowing from south to north to blowing from north to south because you get the winter monsoons blowing. So that was the monsoons that the Odia sailors would have used to catch the wind and sail out towards Indonesia, which is why Bali Jatra is done at that time. And of course, this is celebrated to this day because on Kartik Purnima day, what you have to this day, women and children go to a water body and they put a small boat with a small lamp in it before sunrise. Basically, what they are doing, they are reenacting saying goodbye to their menfolk who were sailing out towards Indonesia. So this is why that festival is celebrated in this particular way to this day. So a festival to this day. So this was the world we were living in. Now, one important thing needs to be realized that we tend to think of, Indic civilization and trade going outward. You have to remember that there was a lot of trade coming in and a lot of influence of these coming inwards as well. So, for example, the Pallava dynasty, which was one of the great dynasties of southern India, it is interesting what its origin myths are. Now, there is a lot of confusion about how the Pallava dynasty came to be established. Some talk about a Chola prince, some talk about some Brahmin who set it up, and there are many other. There is even some legend. Somebody thinks it may have involved a Parthian prince, whatever. But all these legends all have one thing in common, in that they involve a marriage to a Naga princess. Now, so the question is, who was this Naga princess? Because clearly this Naga princess seems to be more important than the male that she happened to have married, because the Pallavas seem to have derived their royal lineage from this Naga princess, not from the male line. So who was this Naga princess? It turns out that the evidence suggests that she was either from northern Malaysia or from Cambodia. So this Naga princess was very likely a princess from Southeast Asia who married perhaps a local prince or somebody who was a respected person, and it led to the foundation of this of the Pallava dynasty. Now, that was not the end of the link to the Pallava or to Southeast Asia. After many generations, in the beginning of the 8th century, the male line of the Pallavas ran out because the king died early, and he died before having any children, or at least a male heir. So there was a big crisis in the Pallava court because now they didn't know who to become king, and they were very concerned that the Chalukyas would attack and take them over. At this juncture, somebody remembered that a few generations earlier, the younger brother of the Pallava king, whose name was Bhima, had sailed off to a distant country and had married a Naga princess and set up a kingdom. So somebody said that maybe somebody should go to this king and see if Bhima has a descendant, and then we can get Bhima's descendant to come and rule the Pallava Empire. So a delegation was sent from Mahabalipuram, and they sailed to this distant kingdom. We're not told where this distant kingdom was, but we know it was somewhere across the ocean. And they brought back. So when they reached there, they found that there was indeed a descendant of Bhima, and that descendant was a local prince, and he had 4 sons. Now, the first 3 sons were asked whether they would want to come back to India, and they refused. They were probably elder sons, so they probably likely that they would get some kingdom or something. But the youngest one, who was only 12 years old, agreed. So this 12-year-old was then brought to India, and he was crowned king, and he became the Pallava king Narasimha Varman II. Nandi Varman II. And Nandi Varman II would then go on to become one of the most important kings of southern India. We know this story incidentally because Nandi Varman has left this story on the walls of an important temple in Kanchi, which was his capital, which is not far from Chennai, and you can go and see this whole story which has been carved out on the walls of a temple in Kanchipuram. And then he's carved this story out as well. What is interesting, however, if you look at the faces of all the main characters of the story, you will see that they don't look like Indians. Forget about looking like Tamils, they don't look like Indians at all. They look like Southeast Asians. So they do not look like. So the reason I'm telling you this story is that when you begin to hear India's history from a maritime perspective, you will realize that it was a much more cosmopolitan place. There were much more people going back and forth, and it was about a lot more risk-taking, open culture than we tend to imagine our past to be. Now, this world, by the 10th century, had evolved into this maritime world, was really the center of world economic activity. So by the beginning of the 11th century, for example, if you asked about the sort of corridor, the anchor of world trade, it was the maritime route from Egypt, which was then ruled by the Fatimids, through the Red Sea and the Arabian to southern India, which was then by this point ruled by the Cholas, and then through to Southeast Asia, all the way through to Song Empire in China. This was the trading route of that. A lot of trade was going back and forth between China and the Mediterranean. And of course, the Cholas were at the heart of this trade. Now, what happens is quite interesting is that in Southeast Asia, a lot of geopolitics happens. You see, there are two routes, as I mentioned, to go to China, Japan, Korea from India through Southeast Asia. One is through the Malacca Straits, which is between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. And the other is through the Sunda Straits, which is between Sumatra and Java. Now, usually the Javans used to control the Sunda Strait, and the Sumatrans, which is the Srivijaya Empire, used to control the Malacca Straits. Now, what happened is in the beginning of the 11th century, the Javans defeated the Sumatrans, and the Sumatrans went and asked for help from the Chinese. So the Chinese provided a lot of backup to the Sumatrans, as a result of which the Chinese then pushed out the Javanese from both the Malacca Straits, but also from the Sunda Straits, and suddenly the Srivijaya were controlling both the straits. Now, having taken control of both the straits, they did what all monopolists do. They began to charge very high tariffs, which the Cholas did not like. And it appears that in 1017, Rajendra Chola sent a fleet to warn the Srivijaya that they were not happy with this. But it obviously didn't have the requisite impact. So in 1025, a very large fleet was sent by the Cholas to Southeast Asia, and they went and sacked various Srivijaya ports, and finally defeated the main army of the Srivijaya in Kedah, which is in northern Malaysia, what was then called Kadaram. This may incidentally have been the original area from which the Pallavas had come, because this area also has inscriptions by Nandi Varman. Now, after that, the fleet came back. I want to clarify here that it was a raid. The Cholas clearly exerted geopolitical presence in the area. It was not an act of a conquest. I don't think we can claim that the Cholas were in full possession of Southeast Asia at this juncture. Very often, Indians in misplaced nationalism tend to try and overplay the history. There's plenty of good things in Indian history, but it is unnecessary to try and overplay what is already a very interesting history. So the Cholas exerted geopolitical influence over Southeast Asia. They did not conquer Southeast Asia. That is a very different, it means something totally different. Now, this is the world that existed till the 11th century. Now, by the 12th century, however, this world completely collapsed. Now, this collapsed due to huge invasions coming in from Central Asia, which destroyed all these civilizations I described. The Mongols obviously destroyed China. They also completely destroyed the Middle East, and they sacked Baghdad and completely destroyed it. And at about the same time, the Turks invaded India and they completely ransacked India. Today, because of misplaced idea of secularism, we very often try to underplay the story of the Turkic conquest of India. But the Turkic conquest of India is a pretty horrific episode in world history. And millions of people would have died. Dozens of ancient cities were completely destroyed. Some great universities were completely destroyed. And there was absolute chaos. Now, this is also important in this context to understand why the sacking of Hindu temples was such a major economic shock, not just a cultural and religious shock. In order to understand that, you have to understand that the temples were not possessing such large amounts of gold and wealth because the kings were all handing their wealth over to these temples. Even in ancient times, it was very difficult to get Indian politicians to hand over their money. It is true that many of them built large temples to glorify themselves so that they would be remembered. But even in ancient times, I can assure you that Indian politicians weren't handing their money over certainly not to the temples. The reason the temples had such a lot of money was because the temples functioned as banks. Many of these voyages that I was describing all this while were voyages financed by these temples. And that is why they had so much money. We have copper plates, for example, of how these temples financed infrastructure projects, how they financed, you have tripartite agreements between merchant guilds and weaver guilds and the temple to finance production of exportable items and so on. And in this context, again, I want to say that these merchant guilds were what were doing these huge voyages. It was not individual merchants going out. You are really dealing with what are effectively multinational companies. Many of them had their own fleets with own armies, and many of them survived many changes of dynasties. So there are, there was a merchants guild called the 500, which survived the Pallavas, it survived the Cholas, and so on. So there were these huge merchant guilds, and similarly there were weaver guilds and metallurgy guilds. Many of them we now think of as castes, but in fact they were guilds. And these guilds were part of this massive trading networks. Now, when the Turkic invasion happened and these temple banks got destroyed, what happened is that India lost its financial muscle. And with that loss, what happens is India goes into economic decline. So although, yes, the other empires happen, it now becomes much more a land-based history because those who conquered India after that were basically coming from Central Asia. They were land-based people. And you begin to see the Indian Ocean being taken over by Arabs and by the beginning of the 15th century by the Chinese. So I'm going to now come to the end of my lecture because I'm running out of time. But basically what you have here is by the beginning of the 15th century, the Chinese had essentially thrown out the Mongols, and you have the Ming dynasty coming to power. Now, the Ming dynasty were very conscious of the fact that they had thrown out these foreigners, and they were re-establishing Chinese power. And in that case, in that sense, they were very similar to modern China. They were very conscious of this sort of couple of centuries of humiliation, and they were trying to re-establish Chinese dominance. And one of the things they did as a result of that was send these gigantic voyages called the treasure fleets to the Indian Ocean, led by, interestingly, a eunuch called Admiral Zheng He. He was a very unlikely person to be leading these because he was a Muslim eunuch from a landlocked place called Yunnan. But nevertheless, he led these gigantic voyages, and 17 of these voyages over a period, several decades in the early 1400s. And these voyages came into the Indian Ocean. They made their way around. They came to India. They came to Sri Lanka. They made their way all the way to Arabia and the east coast of Africa. There have been claims that they even have made their way to the Americas, but frankly, there is no strong evidence of this, although some authors have tried to make this case. But nevertheless, these were very impressive things. Many of the ships that the Chinese were using at this stage were several generations ahead of what the Europeans had. Even almost 100 years later, the ships that say, the Vasco da Gama and Columbus were using were, 1/4 of the size of what Jung He was using. So these were huge ships, and there were 25,000-30,000 people in each one of these voyages. And these voyages were not voyages of trade or discovery, because they were basically sailing in areas which the Chinese already knew. These were well-established trade routes, which we have already discussed. Chinese pilgrims, merchants had been sailing it for generations before that. But why they were sailing here was, as I said, for geopolitical reasons. They were trying to do, in some senses, what maybe the Chinese are today trying to do in Ladakh or in the South China Seas. And they also began to do many maneuvers of geopolitical nature. One of the things they did, which had lasting impact, was that they came in conflict with the Majapahit Empire of the Java. This was then the most powerful empire in the Indian Ocean region. The Majapahit were, of course, a Hindu empire, and they had conquered large parts of what is now Indonesia. Now, by this point, the Indians had already gone into decline, and they were not a maritime power anymore. Even though the Vijayanagar Empire would rise, and they would have a lot of maritime trade, the Vijayanagar Empire never had sizable maritime presence. So it was the Majapahit that were really the true maritime power of that time in the Indian Ocean. And obviously, they came in conflict with the Chinese. So the Chinese did something very interesting. They began to turn the Malays of Malacca against the Majapahit and began to back them. And they, interestingly, in order to basically fight back against the Majapahit Hindus, they encouraged the Malaccans to convert to Islam. So it is with Chinese backing that the Malays began to push back against the Indonesians. And this is the context in which the Islamization of Southeast Asia happened. And slowly the Majapahit basically were pushed back, and the last of the Majapahit, who refused to convert, basically backed up into one island of Bali, where they have preserved the Majapahit culture to this day. So the Balinese are essentially the last of the Majapahit. And they have preserved this medieval Hindu culture that had existed in this part of the world till the 15th, 16th century. Now, one would have, if he had been, say, in the middle of the 15th century, if you had been wandering around the Indian Ocean world, you would have taken the call that, this was complete Chinese dominance and that the future was entirely Chinese. That, unfortunately, is not how history very often turns out. What happened is that in China, there was a lot of internal politics. As I told you, Zheng He was a eunuch, and the navy was consequently the preserve of the eunuch party in the Chinese Ming court. The Ming emperor then died, and the new Ming emperor who came to power was basically backed by the Confucian mandarins or the bureaucrats. And they were suspicious of the eunuchs. So because they were suspicious of the eunuchs, they began to essentially turn off these sources of power of the eunuchs. And so, like good bureaucrats, they switched off the funding to the Chinese Navy. So the eunuch suddenly found that they could no longer use the navy, and the navy then went into sharp decline. So the Chinese period of naval dominance ended not because of defeat, but because of bureaucrats. So as I always be very, very wary of pissing off the babus, because if once they turn off the money, then even a great empire will rapidly go into decline. And so the Chinese dominance of the Indian Ocean basically suddenly disappeared over the subsequent couple of decades. And so when Vasco da Gama turned up in the Indian Ocean world, he essentially found a power vacuum. The Chinese had been there and they had knocked out everybody and then disappeared. The Majapahit had disappeared. And the Chinese themselves had gone away. And it would have appeared that the Arabs were trying to sort of dominate it again. But essentially, it was a power vacuum. And this is the context in which the Portuguese turn up. Now, many often we'll wonder sometimes, why is it that the Europeans, particularly a small country like the Portuguese, were able to take over the Indian Ocean so very quickly when this world had existed for thousands of years? How were they able to do this? After all, unlike, say, the Americas, where they were unused to cannons and other modern technology, the people of the Indian Ocean world very quickly caught on to cannons, and they were they had maritime experience and ships and everything. Why is it that they so quickly fell apart when the Portuguese turned up? The reason for that is that the Chinese had first been in there and they had knocked everybody else out, and then for their own domestic reasons gone away. So this is the context, ladies and gentlemen, in which European dominance of the Indian Ocean took place. Now, with that, I'm going to now stop, because the story subsequent to the arrival of the Europeans is much better known, and I'm sure there is a lot of interesting Q&A that we can have. Thank you very much.